My daughter-in-law made her announcement at the Christmas table between the main course and dessert. 17 people in the room. My son, my grandchildren, Nicole's parents, her sister and her husband. 3 of Lucas's cousins who had driven up from New Haven. A neighbor couple I had known for 20 years. Nicole stood up and raised her glass and said that she wanted to take a moment to address something that had been weighing on her. She said that for years this family had been relying on Eleanor's generosity. She said the word generosity the way people say a word when they mean its opposite. She said it was time to acknowledge that the arrangement had become unbalanced. That Eleanor contributed financially while others contributed in different ways. That perhaps going forward, a more equitable structure was needed. 17 people looked at me. I looked at Nicole. I picked up my wine glass. I said, quote, 0. I took a sip. What Nicole did not know, what none of those 17 people knew, was that I had made 3 phone calls the week before Christmas, and that the equitable structure she was proposing had already been in place for 6 days. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old. I live in Connecticut. I taught high school English for 22 years. I have one son, Lucas, who is 38 years old and who married Nicole 4 years ago. I have spoken about Nicole before. She is organized, she is efficient, she identifies what she wants, and she moves toward it with the particular confidence of someone who has rarely encountered an obstacle she could not manage. She had attempted to remove me from my home twice in the preceding year. Both times, she had encountered the specific obstacle of a woman who had been preparing for exactly those attempts for considerably longer than Nicole had been preparing to make them. This is the 3rd time. The financial arrangements I had with Lucas and Nicole were not complicated. They were, in fact, entirely straightforward once you understood their history. When Lucas and Nicole married 4 years ago, they were living in an apartment in the city. A good apartment, but expensive. Lucas was in the early years of his career as an architect, and his income was sufficient, but not generous. Nicole was working and earning well, but they had taken on more apartment than their combined income comfortably supported because Nicole had wanted a particular address in a particular neighborhood, and Lucas had agreed. I had helped. Not with the rent. I want to be clear about that. I had not been paying their rent. What I had been doing was covering 3 specific recurring costs. The monthly parking space connected to the apartment, which was a separate lease. Lucas's professional association membership fees, which were significant and which he needed to maintain his licensure. And the car insurance for both vehicles, which I had added them to when they married, because the combined policy I had maintained since Richard died offered substantially better rates than anything they could obtain independently. These 3 things came to $1,100 a month. I had been paying them for 4 years. Not secretly, Lucas knew. We had discussed it when they married, and I had said, "Let me cover these 3 things for the first few years while you establish yourselves. It is not a gift, it is a bridge. When you are stable, you take them on, and that is that." Lucas had said, "Mom, you don't have to." I had said, "I know, I want to." Nicole had said thank you and had not mentioned it again. In 4 years, she had not mentioned it once. Not at dinners, not in conversations about their finances, not when they took a vacation I knew they could not fully afford, or when they renovated the kitchen of the apartment, or when Nicole bought the car she had been discussing for 18 months. $1,100 a month. 4 years. $52,800. She had never said thank you again after the first time. This, I had noted. I had said nothing about it because I had not given the money in order to be thanked. I had given it because Lucas was my son, and I wanted his early years of marriage to be less financially pressured than they might otherwise have been. But I had noted it. 3 months ago, Margaret, my accountant, sat across from me during our quarterly meeting and said, "Eleanor, I want to walk through your recurring commitments and make sure they still reflect your intentions." We walked through them. When we reached the $1,100 a month, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "How much longer are you planning to continue this?" I said, "That is a good question." She said, "They've been married 4 years. Lucas's income has grown considerably. Nicole earns well. From a purely financial perspective, they no longer need this bridge. I said, no, they don't. Lucas and Nicole's vehicles had been removed from my policy, and they had been notified by the insurance company that they would need to establish independent coverage. All 3 notifications had been sent by the respective companies on the days of the changes. Nicole had received all 3. She had not mentioned any of them to me, which meant she had received formal notifications that 3 financial supports were being withdrawn and had chosen, rather than calling me to discuss it, to stand up at my Christmas table and make a speech about equitable structures. I had sat through the main course knowing what was in her phone. I had poured the wine and passed the rolls and asked the right questions about Frank and Diane's recent trip and listened to Lucas's cousin talk about his new job. And I had waited, because the dessert was going to be considerably more interesting than the main course. Nicole's speech lasted approximately 4 minutes. I know this because I counted. Not obsessively, with the particular attention of someone who is listening to something being performed and wants to understand its full dimensions before responding to it. She spoke about family balance. She spoke about the importance of everyone contributing equally. She spoke about how generational wealth created unhealthy dynamics and how she and Lucas had been discussing the importance of standing on their own as a couple. She said these things in the warm, considered tone of someone who has practiced them and who believes the audience will receive them as reasonable. Several people at the table nodded. Frank nodded. Diane nodded. Lucas's cousin from New Haven nodded, with the particular enthusiasm of a young man who has absorbed certain ideas about financial independence and recognizes them when they are spoken aloud. Lucas looked at the table. He had been looking at the table since Nicole stood up. When she sat down, there was a brief, warm murmur of the kind that follows a speech that sounds balanced and considered to people who do not have the full picture. Nicole looked at me. I looked at her. I said, I appreciate you raising this, Nicole. I think clarity about financial arrangements is always valuable. She said, I'm glad you agree. I just think it's important that we talk about these things openly as a family. I said, I completely agree. She smiled. Frank said, Well said, Nicole. These things are worth discussing. Diane said, It takes courage to bring something like this up. I said, It does. Nicole is very courageous. I said it without any particular emphasis, and I watched Nicole receive the sentence and process whether it was a compliment or something else, and arrive correctly at the understanding that it was both simultaneously. I said, Actually, since we're discussing financial arrangements openly, perhaps this is a good moment to mention that I made some adjustments last week. The table shifted slightly. The particular shift of 17 people who were comfortable a moment ago and are now paying a different quality of attention. Nicole said, Adjustments? I said, The parking space at your building, the professional association membership, the car insurance. I contacted each of them the week before Christmas and made the necessary changes. A silence. Not the warm murmuring kind, the kind that arrives when a room understands that something is happening that it was not prepared for. Nicole said, You canceled them? I said, I transferred them. The parking space is now in your names directly. Lucas's association membership is now billed to Lucas. The insurance company contacted you both separately to let you know you would need to establish your own policy. Nicole said, I received those notifications. I said, I thought you might have. She said, I didn't think. I said, You didn't mention them when you received them. I assumed that meant you had processed the information and were comfortable with the new arrangement. Since you've been discussing the importance of standing on your own as a couple, I thought the timing was actually quite good. The table was very quiet. Frank had stopped nodding. Diane was looking at Nicole with an expression that was not the one she had been wearing when she said, It takes courage. Lucas's cousin from New Haven had found something interesting to look at in his dessert spoon. Lucas was still looking at the table, but differently now. Not with the discomfort of a man avoiding a situation, with the expression of a man who has just understood the full shape of something he had been seeing only in pieces. Nicole said, Eleanor, I think this conversation might be better had privately. I said, You raised it at the table, Nicole, in front of 17 people. I'm simply providing the complete picture. It seemed relevant given the topic. She said, The amounts were... She stopped. I said, $1,100 a month for 4 years. I had Margaret run the total last week. $52,800. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which a number has arrived and reorganized everything. Frank said, 52,000? I said, The parking, the membership, the insurance. 4 years. I don't mention it as an accusation. I mention it because Nicole raised the topic of financial contributions, and I thought the full picture was worth having. Nicole said, That's not what I meant by this conversation. I said, What did you mean? She said, I was talking about going forward. About independence going forward. I said, And I facilitated exactly that. As of last week, you are completely independent of my financial support. I would have thought that was welcome news given what you just said. She looked at me, not with the organized certainty of the woman who had stood up 4 minutes ago with her glass raised, with the expression of a person who has executed a plan precisely and arrived at an outcome that was not in the plan. Her sister was looking at the tablecloth. Nicole's mother, Diane, reached for her wineglass and then put it down without drinking. Lucas looked up from the table for the first time. He looked at Nicole. He looked at me. He said nothing, but the looking was the kind that carries weight, the kind that means a man has arrived at an understanding he will need time to fully process and is not going to pretend otherwise. I said, Shall we have dessert? I stood up and began clearing the main course plates with the calm efficiency of a woman who has been hosting Christmas dinners for 30 years and who knows that the best thing to do after a significant moment at a table is to give people something ordinary to do with their hands. Dessert was apple pie. I had made it the day before from the recipe my mother had used and that I had been making at Christmas for 30 years. It was the kind of pie that fills a room with a particular smell, cinnamon and brown sugar and the specific warmth of something that has been made with attention, and the smell did what it always does at a table that needs something ordinary to anchor itself to. People passed plates. People found their forks. The particular social machinery of a meal resumed with the slightly forced quality of a group that has witnessed something and is collectively deciding how to process it. I poured coffee. I sat back down. Nicole had not spoken since dessert began. She was eating with the focused attention of a woman who is managing several things simultaneously and has chosen her plate as the least complicated of them. Her sister had moved her chair very slightly, not dramatically, barely perceptible, but I noticed it. The small physical adjustment of someone who has decided to create a little distance from the person they arrived with. Frank said, Eleanor, this pie is extraordinary. I said, Thank you, Frank. He said, I don't know what to say to that. I said, You don't have to say anything. Call the broker. He said he would. He said goodbye. I said goodbye. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and looked at the garden in its December stillness. The bare rose bushes, the lavender, gray and patient. The particular quality of a winter garden that is not finished, only resting. Nicole stood up at my Christmas table and called my generosity a problem. I had made 3 phone calls the week before. The problem resolved itself. It usually does when you stop waiting for someone else to solve it. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has someone ever tried to reframe your generosity as a burden? Tell me how you handled it. I read every single one.